welcome back to another episode. This is the last one of the week. This is a Neil Jordan double bill. Company of Wolves and Into the Vampire. Jordan made another vampire film later, but I covered it in my vampire video from a year or two ago, so I don't really feel like covering it. Plus, it's a later film in his career after doing a bunch of films. These are both films he made quite early in his first 10-15 years of his career, so I'm placing these together. Company of Wolves was his second film, and Into the Vampire was his follow-up to Crying Game after he'd had a couple of flops in Hollywood. So they're different places in his career, really. One was him still the bright new thing, another one was him after being beat up a little bit before he went into a very normal career. After Into a Vampire and Michael Collins, he had a normal career, ups and downs, kind of indie director ultimately. He didn't do many blockbusters, but he did a bunch of stuff. He's done a few bombs, but he's done a few interesting films. He's done the Borders TV show, so he's had a career, basically. But this is still early on, so I'm not going to bother with spoilers because the films are so old, you should have seen them by now if you're watching this video. If you haven't, there's not much I can do. But they're not really plot-focused films anyway, so I'm not that bothered with spoilers. But these are still pretty early films from him. So Company of Wolves is based on Angela Carter's stories, and she wrote the script with Jordan. This is after he'd done Angel, which is his directorial debut, starring Stephen Rea. And also, Into the Vampire came after he did a big film, Stephen Rea. That's not a connection. Before that, he'd been an assistant to John Boorman as well, because he's an Irish director, and John Boorman lives in Ireland. So he was a protege of John Boorman, and John Boorman helped him a little bit. But he hooked up with Stephen Woolley at Palace and Nick Powell. And this was their first big film. After this, he went on. This one didn't do that well, but it was well respected. Then he went on to Mona Lisa, which was a big hit. So this was a double thing where this one's critical, the other one was a critical and commercial. So he was the big new thing. Plus, Angel was well received, even though it didn't make a lot of money. It was well received. So this was he'd 3 in a row of good films. The Company of Wolves is the most expansive one and the weirdest one for a lot of people because it is about werewolves, but it's done it in a kind of dark fantasy thing rather than a horror movie, ultimately. The werewolf transformations are not meant to scare you. They might scare some people, but for most horror fans, these are not scary things. These are dramatic moments. It's a big difference. Other directors have tried to do this. I mean, if you look at Wolf, Mike Nichols did, he tried to do the same thing where the transformations were less about horror, more about drama. But he didn't pull it off. He never knew how to pull it off. But this film does pull it off because it's got the script to do it. And it's got the idea of what it is about. So it's basically about puberty for a young woman who's going from a girl to a woman. This is my second one on this subject today. Covering it. I mean, the video Memento Mori is come a few days earlier, but it's it feels I'm following a pattern. So as a metaphor for that, but this is much more about a dream state. You see in the beginning of the film when dreaming, then you enter our dreams, and so the people you saw as a family at the beginning, who you never see or interact with ever, it's always just this fantasy life. So you see in a modern day sleeping, and outside a room is this big, massive house is our mother, father, and sister. In the dream logic, her sister is killed by wolves, which causes a little smell when she's dreaming, which is a nice little touch because it's all about the fact that girls who are sisters don't always get on very well. There's jealousy, and there's competition, there's brutality at times. But as a kind of old-fashioned superstitious landscape. And this takes into account of all these sort of wolves and Little Red Riding Hood, and this kind of idea of a society that's built up upon basic survival is you kill animals for food, basically, to make soup, to make clothes. These the culture is basically wolves are bad, animals are bad, they're evil. All the superstitions are about how evil animals are, especially wolves. So it justifies you killing them for food because they can kill you, but you can also just leave them alone. You just have to be careful around them. And then as the film goes on, she starts to see telling stories and getting told stories by Granny, played by Angela Lansbury, about wolves and how evil they are, and how they're all tied to the devil, and how they're the scariest ones, the ones that are hairier on the inside because they're part wolf, part man. And it's just the idea of a girl learning how to deal with, sexuality and how boys can have a physical side to them, not just things she grew up with. There is another element to there that she's trying to deal with. So it becomes this metaphor for sexuality and how people grow and learn to deal with each other as adults and as sexual beings. That's the kind of idea. And it's how it kind of mutates through stories itself and how stories can pervert things, and the old wives' tales that say these people are all horrible and how you shouldn't trust men and all that stuff from the point of view of what she's wanting to know because she's not quite sure about how to deal with men, how to deal with her attractions and things like that. And it's just about how your emotions and these stories tied into your culture affect you and create your personality. But it's all done within stories. So instead of doing a naturalistic thing, it's about stories. She's dreaming this, but she's telling and hearing stories in the dreams. And she ends up getting a shawl that's just like Little Red Riding Hood. But instead of the Little Red Riding Hood, the wolf trying to eat her and killing her granny, the wolf still kills her gran because she's telling lies about wolves. But also, she basically joins the wolves at the end, rather than killing them. And it's like this whole thing about becoming a wolf is almost like your maturity. You've matured and become a person rather than just a child. So you've got all these themes in here, but it's all done in studio. It's all done. The only time you're out of studio really is a few exterior shots at the beginning and a few exterior shots to set up a few of the stories. But most of the time you're in a studio and it's always a studio. And I'm not trying to hide it. They're actually saying this is internal mind logic. It's what your mind is creating. And just, you have to do suspension of disbelief. And it's fine. It works really well because it's so well worked together. Because the things she dreams come from what she's in her room. And you see them as big versions of those in this dream landscape. And then the dream landscape goes towards the kind of other dreams within dreams, and everything's a metaphor for something. So it's a really wonderful film. The stories themselves are terrific because they're all based on Angela Carter's stories. You've got one where this wolf marries this normal woman, he disappears for a while, then he comes back years later when she's already married and has children and turns into a wolf there. And that's the first time you see a wolf transforming, and it's not just it's a monster, he's a monstrous figure because it's told by her granny telling her how men with whose eyebrows join can't be trusted, and men are wolves on the inside type of thing. But it's really well done. It's really a beautiful horror story, and the actual transformation is dramatic rather than just it shows the pain of it all. I mean, the effects don't hold up in certain ways because you can see the better the picture quality gets, the more you can see the drawings a bit more. But the craftsmanship is so beautiful, and because it's a fantasy world, it doesn't really matter. Because it just ties into the idea of all these giant dolls you see earlier on. So ultimately it ages well because each thing's just a metaphor for something that's very set up in the world. So even the effects, when they age, actually still feels part of the world. It's another story where a young man meets the devil at a crossroads, and the devil's played by Kevin Stamp. And the lead character is his chauffeur in this sequence because he's in a big limo, and he's turning the boys into wolves and giving them things to put in their chest to twigs the hair out, brings the beast out on them. Things like that are just wonderful. The idea of men infected by the devil, and that's why they're so horrible. It ties into the idea of the wolves and things as well. There's a point where a woman gets revenge and how she's been ruined. This is the story, or at least character Rosalind tells, and the idea is that this woman's been done in by these rich people, so she gets revenge and turns them all into wolves and have to run into the forests, and that's wonderfully done as well. It's a big set piece. And then there's the final section's brilliant. Final section, as soon as you get into the Little Red Riding Hood stuff and the granny and what big teeth you have and all the rest of it, it's just wonderful, wonderfully moving. And you get a story about a woman who's become a wolf and she tries to go back home. She can't go home, and it's a wonderful thing about the metaphor of how this girl feels in this dream, and then it's almost like the dream explodes into her life as well. So there's lots of stories within stories. You're never quite sure what reality and what isn't, because technically the dream you're seeing at the beginning should be the reality and everything else is a dream, but the way it's shot, it's not quite that, because the dream world floats through the supposed real world at the end as well, and the actual location of the house and looks like something from the dream. So of course it could be someone dreaming, but also it adds more ambiguity. It's just interesting, because reality is not that important. Ultimately, it's the dream and the idea of what's the reality in your head and what the problems you're dealing with. So, Company of Wolves is wonderful. I've always adored Company of Wolves. I saw it when I was a teenager and I've always loved it. I've watched it plenty of times. It's always a really good one to come back to. Into the Vampire came later. As I said, after its disasters, it made High Spirits and We're No Angels, which were box office and critical disasters. I don't actually mind We're No Angels. It's not that bad. It's not great. It's not that bad. So then he kind of came back to Ireland and tried to do small movies, because he was absolutely burnt out by the big movies. So he did one that didn't do that well, and then he did Crying Game, which he thought was a small movie, that suddenly became a massive hit in America. It didn't even do that well over here. I remember it coming over here and it was there and gone, and everyone saw it on re-release after it became a hit in America, because that's what I saw. It was like suddenly it's become a big Oscar nominated thing, and it was like, what, did that even come out here? And that's how I saw it. And then so suddenly he was big business again. He was the guy who made Crying Game, so he was huge again the way it had been for a while. So at that point, an offer came in from David Geffen, who'd been trying to do Into a Vampire for years. Never get a script right, can never get it working. So he asked Neil Jordan to try it and just come in and try and work with the property and see what he could do with it. So Neil Jordan did it. Now, I've got to say straight away, I do not like the book. I've read the book. I read the book well before the film came out, and I thought it was boring as hell, and I thought it was really obvious in lots of ways. I've actually liked some of the sequel books. Some reason I read them after not liking the original, and they're more fun because they're more about fantasy worlds and weird psychology rather than big questions or whatever. They're much more. They're more. It's more fun, especially the Vampire Lestat book, which has never been touched as a film. So Jordan did his adaptation. Geffen liked it, and he brought him on to direct it. The funny thing is, Geffen had just worked with David Cronenberg on M Butterfly, and M Butterfly was a film that got killed because of the Crying Game. The Crying Game came out just as about to release M Butterfly, and it was both the same idea. So M Butterfly suddenly looked really old. So but he brought in the guy who just trashed his own movie in a weird way, because just out of luck. It wasn't anything beyond that. It was just like... So he brought in Neil Jordan. Neil Jordan did an adaptation. They thought it was a good adaptation, so they let him direct it. And then they did massive casting controversy with Tom Cruise as Lestat, because it was like, how can you cast Tom Cruise as Lestat? That's like absurd. How can you do that? And it was like, then you see a film and he's perfect casting. It's really good, really strong casting. And, it's just one of those things that someone saw something in an actor that no one else had, and they brought it out, and that was it. Brad Pitt as Lewis is is the one who got the worst reviews ultimately, because Lestat's a more fun character and more fun performance. And then you've got Kirsten Dunst, she'd done other films. This is her big debut as like a proper actress in this film, as Claudia, who's this 12-year-old girl who's turned into a vampire. So as she gets older, she becomes darker and she's like grown up in a child's body, and it's kind of tragedy of that situation. And she got all the reviews as well. Antonio Banderas came aboard as the old world vampire. He great reviews. Brad Pitt get absolutely hammered in this, which is a shame because he actually is okay. He's fine, but he's playing a character who's, suffering throughout the film, trying to work out his place in the world, and he's got all the stuff from the book that I thought was boring because it was so obvious. It's like, where do I fit in the world? What do I do in the world? All that stuff, and it's like, that stuff's boring. It's like you're a vampire. It's too late. This film cuts all that down to the basics and actually makes it work. The way the book just dragged on. Right, so this works. This Lewis version Lewis works a lot better. Plus, Brad Pitt's got a sense of humour, which comes out at times, especially in the interview sections where he's with Christian Slater, and there's some humour between them both there. And there's some dry humour there as well. But he does have the kind of suffering character, and he is the kind of character the actor gets clobbered, and he obviously hated being in that film. But it's one of those things. It's just like, well, that's the part. He's stuck with the part that is depressed. But you can need that character though. If you didn't have that character, the film would be too up, and it'd make it too much fun to be a vampire. And because he's depressed and he's not finding it any fun, it gives you the idea of the nature of these vampires. Because the whole idea of this film is, it's almost like what would happen if you're watching a vampire series of stories, and and this is stuff that happened when you weren't watching them if they hadn't been killed. It's that kind of thing. Is like, what happens to a villain when they're not being a villain? Well, they get depressed and bored and they try and have a family and they try and do this and that, and nothing ever works out for them. It's that kind of thing. It's like, what happens to a villain when you're not looking and you're not involved in a plot? So the story is, Lewis is this character who, his wife died in childbirth, so he doesn't want to live. Then Tom Cruise seduces him to say, I can take it away the pain and actually give you a new life. That's wonderful. Doesn't tell him anything else. It makes it all sound so cool. And of course, something a vampire, and suddenly realises they kill people to survive. And he's basically a predator. Now, the Lestat characters learn to live with that. It's like, he's made it a sport. It's like, he's actually worked out, like, you're not human anymore. You're an animal of a different sort. You've been changed to something else. These people are cattle the same way you would view cattle. You can't be sentimental about it. That's your only way to survive. It's just like, yeah, he's a killer, but he's found his way around it. Lewis hasn't figured that out, and he's suffering through everything. And that malaise affects Lestat as well. But it's almost like the whole idea of the film is, how does vampires survive? And the idea is they have to latch on to new people from new generations so they can understand the new generation. Otherwise, they'll become stuck in the past. And the whole film is about how to avoid being stuck in the past if you live forever. And if you're basically a killer. So the film is like Company of Wolves, it's an episodic bunch of stories. It's not literal stories this time, it's just like situations the characters get themselves in. So Lewis becomes a vampire, Lewis and Lestat fight for a long time, then they find Claudia turn into a vampire, it's the happy family for all. Then there's a massive breakup there. Lewis and Claudia go to Europe to look for vampires, eventually find vampires in Paris, it all goes wrong, they kill Claudia, Lewis kills all of them, and Lewis learns to live as a vampire, finally realising there is no hope. He just has to go on the way Lestat had been doing in the first place. So that's just the basic plot, bunch of episodes. And it was one of those films that opened huge and then it dropped off pretty quick. 'Cause I think people weren't expecting that. Because it's an art house film with a mega budget. Which is what I love about the film. It really is. And it's so blatantly homoerotic. It really is. There's no hiding it. They try to do stuff on the publicity. It's vampire sex, not homoeroticism. Didn't fool anybody, like, at all. And I think, and to be honest, it was half-hearted at best by them as well. I think it was just like, yeah, we're not allowed to see this because the studio, you know. It's just that thing. Yeah, it's homoerotic as hell in this film. But it's also a film about loneliness, and the idea is that all the vampires are essentially lonely, and they're very isolated. And that kind of anger at their lives and their way of living drives them to violence as well. And drives them to cynicism, dealing with people and just see them as cattle. And it's like, Lewis hasn't really engaged with that kind of animalistic thing. He does not want to be an animal, the way that Lestat manages to do that but keep his personality. He doesn't want to embrace that, Lewis. But he has to find his own way around it, ultimately. Which is to be distant, to be emotionally distant, and not care. And the thing that ultimately is driving him is the loss of his wife and daughter. So he gets a new daughter, and that ends tragedy because she's not his daughter ultimately. She's someone who he sent to hell basically by giving her this life that ultimately will destroy her and makes her sad. So she kind of wants revenge on him in some way, even though she does love him still. It's like, it's a kind of weird, all the relationships are twisted within need and, you know, bitterness for some of the things that other people have made for you that you didn't make yourself. There's all that stuff going on. Which is basically the way people are with each other. People have lots of, like, hidden agendas against each other that sometimes are fall back on something that doesn't even make sense. It's just like, this is what happens in life, really, ultimately. So even though they've become like vampires, they still have all that petty human stuff with baggage they cannot get rid of. It's like, Lestat's always going to be the bully father. And he's always going to alienate people, you know. And Lewis is always going to be that slightly weak, but, you know, very determined figure that was always going to keep moving, even though he hates it. It's just that thing of these existences, and it's about that kind of sense of existence that has no meaning to you. Ultimately, how do you keep going with it? And you see the vampires in Europe, and they don't know how to keep going with it. They've just lost their ability. So, Company of Wolves is all about the promise of growing up. And to the vampire is what happens when you grow up and you realise it's not that good. And it's like, how do you keep going? And what do you do to keep going? Do you become like Lestat, who just becomes sadistic and having fun with it, or do you become like Lewis and become depressed about it? It's like that kind of adulthood that never quite lives up to your fantasies. And that's kind of the theme of the film, and it's how do you deal with that? So it's a kind of a grown-up story with this fantasy element amidst it. But it's also some great set pieces and some great funny moments. I mean, Lestat's a really funny... It's one of Tom Cruise's funniest characters because it allows him to be funny and intentionally and be nasty in a way that he's not really allowed to be when he's being the hero. Like, you're not allowed to slit people's throats as a hero. He can do whatever he wants in this film. So he's having a ball throughout it. He's just played up all the nastiness, but he also has a subtle undertone a lot of the time of loneliness and regret, and he's keeping stuff to himself, and he is a bit of a sadist at times, but you can tell this actor having a ball. And Claudia, when she basically takes out Lestat with poisoning him, is wonderful. Kirsten Dunst is it's a lot of fun, this character, even though again she has the kind of undertones of darkness below it. But Dunst and Cruise together are always a lot of fun because they are like those two siblings who do not get on, like, ever. They will always fight. They'll find a reason to fight. Even though they're, in some ways, adore each other, they're going to fight each other all the way. There's that kind of relationship. and it is a lot of fun. I mean, they're the kind of highlight of the film, those two. But there's also great sequences when Louis gets revenge on the vampires in Paris. There's a theatre of vampires where they've got this elaborate thing where they can pull in victims and no one will ever know, but they're doing this vampire show as well at the same time, which is a wonderful set piece. There's a great moment with when Claudia finally dies, when the sun comes through and the body turns to dust, and then Louis goes in at night after it, and he touches it and the dust just floats away. It's wonderful. There's tons of wonderful moments in this film. There's the moment where Louis finds Lestat again after centuries and they have a talk. It's wonderful as well. There's so many wonderful moments. There's even jokes, little jokes like at one point they called Dracula the Visions of a Demented Irishman, which is a joke because Neil Jordan's also Irish, so he's having a joke at himself, you know. And there's a joke at the end about how Lestat hears the interview at the end. He goes, "Oh, still writing after 200 years." You know, there's stuff like that goes on. It's really funny. The full film has a sense of humour, even amidst all the darkness, which makes it an enjoyable film, despite the fact that it has a weighty feel to it in some ways. So one film is The Early Promise. One film is the after someone's been beaten up a bit, and he makes a film almost about adulthood via vampires, and then he goes on and has his career. But this is, I think, these are two of my favourite Neil Jordan films. These are really wonderful and really well made and very underrated, because people always like to go towards the realistic stuff rather than fantasy stuff, because fantasy is not real. But fantasy can actually be more realistic. You can get into the weeds with a lot of nuances of stuff you can't get to directly through realism, which I think is a real key component of fantasy filmmaking. And both of these are really terrific and very much worth your time. So I hope you enjoyed this week of videos. I'll be back later with some more, but that's me for now. Right, bye.